They called it the Veil tax, the price your body paid for a night with the King of Felmora. Most women paid it once and never came back for change. The high society circuit of the city was a graveyard of bruised egos and battered pride, filled with influencers who had thought they could handle the crown jewel only to limp away by dawn. The whispers in the VIP lounges weren't about his cruelty, but about a terrifying physical excess. Kerrion Veil was an anatomical nightmare for the unprepared, possessing a sheer, invasive scale that turned intimacy into a grueling test of endurance. Inside his sanctuary, the air was devoid of the usual artificial sweetness. It was thick and pressurized. Nythera stood near the expansive glass, her silhouette a sharp, elegant contrast against the sprawling grid of the city. She didn't flinch as the floorboards groaned under his approach. He moved like a tectonic plate, slow, heavy, and inevitable. When he reached for her, his touch was a searing brand against her shoulder. He leaned down, his voice a gravelly vibration that skipped the ears and went straight to her ribs. "You've heard the stories. They say I'm too much for one person to hold." Nythera tilted her head back, meeting his predatory gaze with a look that was purely transactional. "I've built empires in rooms people said were too small, Kerrion. I don't scare easy because of a little surplus." He didn't waste time with the rehearsed charm of a playboy. He led her toward the center of the room, the tension between them tightening until it felt like a physical weight. As the layers of their status fell away, the myth died and the reality took over. The tax wasn't a metaphor. The sight of him was an intimidation tactic written in flesh, a massive, uncompromising presence that made every hushed warning about his size seem like a polite suggestion. The room felt suddenly narrow, crowded by the sheer physical demand of him. Every woman before her had seen that sight and felt their survival instinct kick in. Kerrion remained still, his jaw tight, waiting for the familiar shift in her expression. He braced himself for the wide-eyed terror, the stammered excuse, the sudden realization that she was out of her depth. Instead, a low, melodic sound vibrated from Nythera's throat. It wasn't a gasp or a plea. It was a laugh, sharp and mocking, slicing through the heavy silence of the room. She looked from the daunting physical reality of him back up to his stunned face, her eyes dancing with a wicked, competitive spark. "That's the legendary monster?" she asked, her voice brimming with a defiant, playful heat. "You've been scaring off the local talent with that. I expected a war, Kerrion. Don't tell me you're waiting for an invitation to see if I'm as tough as I look." Before we continue, take a quick moment to like, comment, share, and subscribe, because the story is about to get even more interesting. The chaos of the Obsidian Lounge was a living, breathing creature, and Nythera Solis was the only one with a collar on it. A cooling system failure in the south wing had sent the temperature climbing, and a mix-up with the vintage labels threatened to turn the high-stakes table into a battlefield. Nythera moved through the fray like a conductor, her radio headset a permanent fixture against her jaw. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. With a sharp flick of her wrist and a 3-word command to the floor lead, the tension dissolved before the first bottle could be uncorked. In the center of the madness, perched on a throne of dark leather and polished steel, sat Kerrion Veil. He was the gravity of the room, the sun around which the city's most dangerous predators orbited. Usually, a single look from him was enough to make a person stumble, to forget their own name in the sheer weight of his presence. He had watched Nythera for 3 hours, his eyes tracking the confident sway of her gait, and the way she dismissed a billionaire's drunken advances with nothing more than a raised eyebrow. He decided to test the perimeter. As she strode past his table to address a lighting glitch, Kerrion shifted, his heavy frame blocking her path. The air around him was dense, a localized pressure system that made the surrounding socialites hold their breath. He leaned forward, the ink on his neck shifting with the movement, and reached out to catch the sleeve of her blazer. "The music is 3 decibels too high for a Tuesday," he remarked, his voice a subterranean rumble that usually brought people to their knees. Nythera didn't stop. She didn't even look him in the eye. She simply adjusted her earpiece, her fingers deft and steady. "I'll add it to the punch list, Mr. Veil. Right now, I have a malfunctioning ice machine and a senator who can't find his shoes. Unless you're bleeding or the building is on fire, you're third in line." She sidestepped him with a surgical grace that left him reaching for empty air. Kerrion's hand dropped, his fingers curling into his palm. It was a sensation he hadn't felt in years, the sting of being invisible. He watched her disappear into the crowd, her focus entirely elsewhere, her mind a fortress he hadn't even been invited to siege. His lieutenants glanced at each other, waiting for the explosion, for the order to have her removed or humbled. Instead, Kerrion felt a slow, unfamiliar heat rising in his chest. It wasn't anger. It was the thrill of a hunter realizing the prey wasn't just fast, it was unimpressed. Kerrion didn't handle being ignored with grace. He handled it with a calculated, expensive persistence. By the following afternoon, the lobby of Nythera's firm was a forest of white lilies, their petals so pristine they looked like they had been carved from bone. She walked past them without breaking her stride, the heels of her boots clicking a sharp, rhythmic staccato against the marble. She didn't check the card. She didn't need to. In Velmora, there was only one man who apologized with a floral invasion. He was waiting for her in her glass-walled office, looking like a midnight shadow in a room designed for daylight. He had bypassed her security with the ease of a man who owned the deed to the city. As she entered, he stood, his massive frame eating up the available oxygen. He didn't lead with a threat. He led with a smile that had sent countless women into a spiral, a slow, practiced curve of the lips that promised everything and committed to nothing. "The flowers are a peace offering," he said, his voice a low, honeyed vibration. "I'm told I was a distraction last night. I'd like to make it up to you over dinner, somewhere private, where the ice machines are guaranteed to behave." Nythera didn't smile back. She didn't even drop her bag. She walked straight to her desk, pulled a single sheet of paper from a folder, and slid it across the mahogany surface toward him. "The flowers are a tax write-off, Mr. Veil. This, however, is an invoice." Kerrion picked up the paper, his dark eyes scanning the lines. It wasn't a request for a date or a thank you note. It was a breakdown of costs. "Excessive security presence, 4 hours," he read aloud, his brow arching. "Staff focus disruption. VIP lane bottleneck surcharge. Total, $12,000. He looked up, a spark of genuine amusement dancing in the darkness of his pupils. "You're billing me for standing in my own club." "I'm billing you for the friction you caused," Nythera corrected, leaning back and crossing her arms. "My team spent half the night managing the crowd that was staring at you instead of buying drinks. Your presence created a logistical nightmare that cost me 3 hours of sleep and my lead bartender's patience. If you want my time, you pay the premium. If you want to apologize, you pay the bill. Dinner isn't a currency I accept." Kerrion stared at the invoice, then back at the woman who treated his charm like a budget deficit. For the first time in his life, the most powerful man in Velmora felt the urge to reach for his checkbook, just to see if she'd actually signed the receipt. The porcelain tiles of the Sapphire Lounge were a cool, pristine white, but the air inside the vanity suite was thick with the residue of expensive hairspray and desperate secrets. Nythera was tucked into the furthest stall, her thumb scrolling through a logistics manifest, when the heavy outer door hissed shut. The sharp click of stilettos on stone signaled the arrival of two regulars, women whose lives were a curated sequence of high-fashion galas and empty calories. "I'm telling you, Lena, don't even look at his table," a voice hissed, trembling with a frantic, jagged energy. "He sent me a car. He bought me that vintage piece from the auction. It felt like a dream until we got to the penthouse." Nythera froze, her screen dimming. In the silence of the suite, the girl's ragged breathing sounded like a warning. "He's not a monster," the voice continued, dropping to a whisper that scraped against the walls. "He's just an impossibility. It's not a night of romance, it's a physical siege. I've been to a specialist twice this week. My body feels like it was rearranged by a force that didn't know how to be small. He's built like he was carved out of the earth itself, and he doesn't understand that the rest of us are just glass." A soft sob broke the rhythm of the confession. "I had to leave while he was still asleep. I couldn't even walk to the elevator without shaking. There is a reason no one stays, Lena. It's not that he's cold. It's that he's a giant trying to live in a dollhouse. If you go, you won't come back the same." The other woman murmured a terrified response, and the two fled back toward the safety of the music and the lights. Nythera remained in the shadows, her heart beating a steady, unfazed rhythm against her ribs. She didn't feel the icy dread that usually followed a ghost story. Instead, she felt a clinical curiosity. She stepped out to the mirror, adjusting the sharp line of her blazer. The city had spent months painting Kerrion Veil as a predator, a man with a darkness that consumed the women he touched. But the truth was simpler, more primitive. It was a matter of scale, a matter of a man who had everything, including a physical reality that served as its own barricade against connection. Nythera met her own gaze in the glass. Most women looked at a storm and saw a reason to hide. She looked at the storm and started calculating the structural reinforcement needed to stand right in the center of it. The invitation arrived not as a card, but as a digital transfer, the $12,000 for the friction she had billed him, plus a zero that didn't belong. When Nythera finally answered the private line, Kerrion's voice was a low, resonant hum that seemed to vibrate the glass in her hands. He didn't ask for a date. He didn't mention the flowers. He offered her a contract, a 7-day logistical overhaul of his private retreat, conducted aboard his yacht, the Acheron. The isolation was the first clause. No assistance, no distractions, just two minds reconciling a complex itinerary. As she stepped onto the deck, the city's hum was replaced by the rhythmic lap of the dark harbour water. The yacht was a masterpiece of aggressive elegance, all sharp angles and charcoal-coloured steel. Kerrion was waiting near the stern, his suit jacket discarded and his sleeves rolled up to reveal the dark, intricate ink that wound around his forearms like climbing vines. In the open air, without the artificial filters of the club, his scale felt even more imposing. He was a mountain of a man, making the expansive deck feel suddenly intimate, even cramped. "You bought the invoice?" he asked, his eyes tracking her every movement with a hunger he no longer bothered to mask. "I brought the work," Nythera countered, tapping the tablet she held like a shield. The engines turned over, a deep, visceral thrum that felt like a heartbeat under their feet. As the shoreline of Felmora began to recede into a blur of amber lights, the reality of the contract settled in. There were no powder rooms here to hide in, no staff to buffer the intensity of his focus. Kerrion walked toward her, his shadow swallowing hers long before he reached her. He didn't touch her, but the proximity was a physical weight, a gravitational pull that demanded she acknowledge the space he occupied. 7 days, Nythera. No senators to rescue, no ice machines to fix. Just the two of us navigating the friction. She looked up at him, her expression as unreadable as a closed ledger. She knew the stories now. She knew the tax he extracted without even trying. But as the salt air hit her face and the last of the city's safety vanished, she didn't feel the urge to call a rescue boat. She felt like a strategist finally stepping onto the field. "Then let's get to work, Mr. Veil," she said, her voice steady against the rising wind. "I'd hate for you to feel like you aren't getting your money's worth." The sky over the open water had turned the colour of a fresh bruise, and the Acheron began to pitch against a sea that had lost its patience. Inside the main cabin, the steady rhythm of their work was interrupted by a violent lurch that sent a crystal carafe shattering across the floor. Nythera didn't scream. She simply braced her core, her grip tightening on the edge of the map table until her knuckles mirrored the whitecaps outside. Kerrion moved through the tilting room with a stability that felt supernatural. He wasn't the distant monarch of the underworld anymore. The polished veneer of the Mafia kingpin had been stripped away by the raw necessity of the weather. He crossed the space between them in 2 heavy strides, his presence dwarfing the furniture as he reached out to steady her. His hands, large enough to span her entire waist, locked onto her hips to keep her from being thrown by the next swell. The contact was a lightning strike. In the isolation of the storm, the professional distance they had maintained for days evaporated. He was breathing hard, the heat of his body radiating through his damp shirt, and for the first time, Nythera saw a crack in the armor. His eyes weren't cold or calculating. They were filled with a desperate, starving honesty. "You're the only thing on this boat that isn't shaking," he rasped, his voice barely audible over the roar of the gale hitting the hull. He leaned down, his forehead nearly touching hers, his massive frame creating a private sanctuary in the middle of the chaos. "Everyone else looks at me and sees a payout or a grave. But you look at me like I'm just a problem you're paid to solve." Nythera didn't pull away. She could feel the tectonic power in his muscles, the sheer, overwhelming mass that had sent every other woman into a state of flight. Up close, he was a force of nature, an anatomical wonder that felt like it belonged to an older, more primal world. "Maybe that's because I'm the only one who isn't afraid of the math, Kerrion," she whispered, her gaze locked on the pulse jumping in his neck. He let out a low, ragged sound, a mix of a groan and a surrender. He wasn't trying to charm her now. He was pleading, his fingers digging into her skin with a hunger that was as much about being seen as it was about being touched. He was a man who had built a kingdom to hide the fact that he was too large for the world he lived in. The ship plunged into a deep trough, and for a second they were weightless. In that moment of suspension, the boss died, leaving only the man behind. He pressed closer, his shadow merging with hers, the air between them vanishing as he waited for her to run. Nythera reached up, her fingers tangling in the hair at the nape of his neck, anchoring him. She didn't flinch at the scale of him. She leaned into the storm. The storm outside had settled into a rhythmic, heavy thrum, but inside the master suite, the air was thick enough to choke. The transition from the deck to the bed had been a blur of friction and gravity, but as the final barriers of silk and cotton vanished, the room grew unnervingly quiet. Nythera sat back against the pillows, her dark skin a stark, beautiful contrast to the deep charcoal of the linens. For the first time in her life, she felt her professional composure start to fray at the edges. The rumours hadn't been exaggerations. They had been understatements. Kerrion stood at the edge of the bed, the low light tracing the heavy ink of the dragons across his chest. Without the tailoring of his suits to cage him, his physical reality was staggering. He was built with an uncompromising anatomical excess that made the very idea of intimacy feel like a structural impossibility. He looked like he had been forged for a different species, possessing a sheer, daunting girth that justified every terrified whisper Nithira had overheard in the powder rooms of Velmora. He wasn't just a man, he was a physical ultimatum. He stayed perfectly still, his jaw tight, his eyes searching hers for the inevitable flicker of retreat. He had seen this moment play out a dozen times, the sudden intake of breath, the way the woman's eyes would widen as they realized the veil tax was a debt they simply couldn't pay. He waited for the polite excuse, the sudden chill, the moment she would realize she was glass and he was iron. Nithira felt a sudden, sharp spike of hesitation. Her mind, usually so quick to calculate and resolve, hit a wall. The physical disparity was immense. Looking at him, she understood why the socialites ran. He was a force of nature that didn't fit within the standard margins of a night's entertainment. For a heartbeat, the instinct to protect herself, to remain the untouchable coordinator who never lost her cool, screamed at her to find the door. But then she looked up at his face. She saw the tension in his shoulders, the way he was braced for her rejection as if it were a physical blow. He wasn't a predator waiting to strike. He was a man waiting to be told he was too much to be loved. The hesitation flickered and died, replaced by a heat that was far more dangerous. Nithira didn't reach for her clothes. She reached for him. She let her gaze travel slowly, deliberately, over the daunting scale of him, and then she met his eyes with a look that was purely, unadulteratedly, defiant. The silence in the suite was a suffocating weight, a vacuum waiting for the sound of a closing door. Kerrion remained motionless, his frame casting a shadow that seemed to stretch across the entire room. He was braced for the impact of her departure, his heart a heavy, rhythmic thrum against ribs that felt too small for the breath he was holding. He had seen the hesitation in her eyes, that fractional second where her logic collided with his reality, and he was already mourning the loss of the only woman who had ever truly looked at him. But the sound that broke the tension wasn't the rustle of a discarded dress being retrieved, or the frantic click of heels. It was a laugh. It started as a low, musical vibration in Nithira's throat, before blossoming into a full, irreverent peal of genuine amusement. She leaned back, her curls fanning out against the headboard, her dark eyes bright with a wicked, shimmering fire. She wasn't looking at him with the pale, wide-eyed terror of a victim. She was looking at him with the delighted challenge of a woman who had just found the missing piece of a puzzle. Kerrion flinched, the sound cutting through his ego more sharply than any scream could have. "What?" he rasped, his voice thick with a mix of confusion and wounded pride. "You think this is a joke?" Nithira wiped a stray tear of mirth from the corner of her eye, her gaze dropping once more to the daunting anatomical truth of him, before snapping back to his face. "No, Kerrion, I think it's hilarious. All those whispers, all that dark, brooding mystery. And it turns out the big bad wolf is just worried he's going to break the furniture." She sat up, the movement fluid and devoid of any urge to hide. She moved toward the edge of the bed until she was close enough to feel the radiant heat of his skin. She reached out, her fingers tracing the jagged line of a tattoo on his thigh, her touch steady and reclaiming. "The women in this city are so used to fragile things," she said, her voice dropping to a silken, mocking purr. "They want a man they can tuck into a pocket. But I've spent my life navigating high-pressure zones and impossible demands. Did you really think I'd file a complaint because the job looked a little intensive?" She looked him dead in the eye, her confidence a tangible force that seemed to shrink the distance between them. You'll have to try a lot harder than that to scare me off, Mr. Veil. I don't back down from a project just because the logistics are demanding. In fact, I'm starting to think I'm the only one in Valmora with the proper equipment for the task. Kerrion felt the air return to his lungs in a sharp, jagged rush. The curse wasn't broken by a miracle. It was shattered by her refusal to be intimidated. He didn't see a woman who was going to run. He saw his match. The sun rose over the harbour of Valmora City like a freshly struck match, casting a harsh gold light over the water. The Acheron glided toward the pier with a predatory silence, its dark hull cutting through the morning mist. On the dock, the usual vultures had gathered, paparazzi with long-range lenses and society bloggers with sharpened keyboards, all of them waiting for the same predictable ritual. They were there to capture the Veil exit, the sight of a woman climbing onto the pier with her head down, her makeup smudged by exhaustion and fear, fleeing toward the nearest cab with the haunted look of someone who had survived a disaster. But as the gangway lowered, the air on the dock seemed to thicken. Nythera Solis didn't crawl out of the yacht. She descended as if the steel were her own private runway. She wore the same blazer from the week before, but it was draped over her shoulders with a lethal, relaxed grace. Her curls were perfectly defined, her dark skin glowing in the early light, and her expression was devoid of the trembling fragility the crowd was hunting for. She didn't look like a victim of the Veil tax. She looked like the one who had finally collected the debt. The cameras began to fire, a frantic staccato of shutters, but Nythera didn't flinch or hide her face behind a designer handbag. She paused at the base of the ramp, adjusting her cuffs with a deliberate, slow confidence. Kerrion appeared at the top of the gangway behind her. He wasn't the distant, cold monarch they expected. His focus was entirely on the woman below him, his gaze heavy with a brand of respect that bordered on worship. He looked like a man who had finally met a force of nature he couldn't overwhelm, and the realization had left him more dangerous than ever. One of the bolder reporters shoved a microphone forward, his voice cracking the morning quiet. "Miss Solis, any comment on the rumours? Did you find the night manageable?" Nythera stopped. She turned her head just enough to catch the reporter's eye, a small, wicked smile playing on her lips, the smile of a strategist who had seen the terrain and conquered it. "Manageable?" she repeated, her voice carrying a silken, effortless power that silenced the crowd. "I think you've been listening to the wrong women. Mr. Veil is exactly the kind of project I enjoy. Intense, demanding, and requiring a very specific level of expertise. I'm happy to report the venue was more than adequate for the event." She stepped into the waiting car, the door closing with a solid, expensive thud. Behind her, Kerrion watched the vehicle pull away, his hand resting on the railing with a possessive, territorial grip. The city had been waiting for a walk of shame, but Nythera had given them a victory parade. The aftermath of the morning at the docks rippled through Valmora like a seismic shift. In the high-security silence of his penthouse, Kerrion Veil watched the city's skyline, but his reflection in the glass felt like that of a stranger. For years, he had lived as a man defined by a deficit, a king whose throne was surrounded by a moat no one could cross. He had resigned himself to a life of fleeting, fractured encounters, anchored by a physical reality that acted as a permanent wall. Then came Nythera. He turned from the window as she entered the room, her presence effortlessly reclaiming the space. She wasn't there to deliver a final report or to collect a paycheck. She walked in with the casual, territorial confidence of someone who had surveyed the land and found it wanting only for her own touch. Kerrion realized then that his search hadn't been for a woman who could endure him, but for a woman who could command him. He didn't move toward her with his usual predatory intent. Instead, he stood still, the sheer mass of his frame feeling less like a weapon and more like a foundation. "The city is talking," he said, his voice a low, grounded rumble. "They're waiting for you to vanish like the rest. They think the clock is ticking." Nathira set her tablet on the obsidian-topped table, her gaze steady and dancing with that same irreverent spark that had shattered his isolation on the yacht. "Let them talk, Kerrion. Silence has always been your problem. You've spent too much time letting people's fear define your value." Kerrion took a step forward, his shadow merging with hers. He reached out, not to grasp her, but to offer a hand, palm up. It was a gesture of surrender from a man who had never known the word. "I don't want a consultant, Nathira, and I don't want a secret tucked away in a penthouse." He looked at her, his dark eyes stripped of the Mafia's cold calculation, revealing a raw, singular hunger. "The empire I built is a lonely place for a man who can't find a match. I want you at the head of the table. I want the city to see that the only thing more dangerous than Kerrion Veil is the woman who isn't afraid of him." Nathira looked at his hand, then back up to the man who had finally met his limit. She didn't hesitate. She placed her hand in his, her fingers locking with his, with a grip that promised a beautiful high-stakes war. "The head of the table," she mused, a wicked smile tugging at her lips. "I hope you're prepared, Kerrion. My rates for running an empire are significantly higher than a 1-week contract." "Consider the bill paid," he whispered, drawing her in. In the heart of Felmora, the mystery was finally solved. The boss hadn't found a lover. He had found his queen.